Hey everyone, we are going to look at writing a linear equation from a graph. So some things we want to remember is when you're writing a linear equation from a graph, typically we put it in what's called slope-intercept form, which is where we see y equals mx plus b. The m of the equation that's going to represent your slope of that line. So the number that's in front of x, okay, number in front of x is your slope. And then this number that does not have a variable at the end, that is going to be your y-intercept. And also it's important to remember that the formula for slope is we're looking at the change in y over the change in x, which you can also refer to as your rise, or we could say your fall, depending on if it's going up or down, and that's over your run, which is your left to right movement. So let's look at an example of writing an equation from a graph. So we want to know what is the equation of the line in slope-intercept form. So we have to remember we're writing it as y equals mx plus b. And I'll write this here just for reference. The m is going to represent our slope, and the y is going to represent our y-intercept of the line. So what I like to do first is I like to look at where the y-intercept is, okay? In this case, you can put a circle around it, but we're seeing this line, and this line is kind of different because it only shows us a portion of this graph. We only have quadrant 1 of this graph. So if we look, we can see that it looks like this line is going to meet the y-axis at the origin or at 0, 0. So we could say that the y-intercept of this line would just be 0. And then the slope, you can pick 2 points, and you want to make sure you pick 2 points that cross the line at the x and y axis. So for instance, if we pick this point right here, this point does not cross at the x and the y. It kind of crosses in the middle. And so this isn't going to give us a good point to look at for finding the slope. So I'm just going to erase this, and we're going to look at different points. So if we pick out this point right here, we could also use 0, 0 or the origin, but I'm going to go to this one right here. And then what I want to do is I want to count. You want to figure out what your rise, so your slope is your rise over your run. Over your run. So you want to count how many times you go up, and you want to take into consideration how many units the x and the y axis are increasing. So it looks like here we're increasing by 100, okay, on both the x and the y. And so when we go up, this is 100, 200, and then 300. So our rise is 300. And then from this point here, you want to become level with the next point. That's where we stop. And then we would count over, and this would just be 100. Okay. And then we can reduce this, and we could say, okay, we've got the same amount of zeros in the numerator as the denominator. So now we have 3 over 1, which is just going to mean that our slope is 3. Now, when you write this as in slope-intercept form, we're just going to basically plug in a number for m and plug in a number for b. And so we could say y equals 3, and then you leave x. And then our b was 0, so I'm going to put plus 0 here. But one thing to remember is anytime you have a line that goes through the origin, you can kind of just drop all this off at the end and just write it as y equals 3x. And that will tell you that your y-intercept is going to be at 0. All right. Let's look at another one. So this one is a little bit bigger of a graph. It's showing you all 4 quadrants of the graph. Another thing to consider is we are counting again by 100s. So we want to put it in slope-intercept form. Y equals mx plus b. Our m is our slope, our b is our y-intercept. So I'm going to first look at where does my line cross the y-axis. And the y-axis is going to be this red line here, just to highlight it. And then we would look at where does it cross, and we could say it's going to cross at negative 600. So I would say my y-intercept is going to be negative 600. And then my slope, that's where I'm going to look at those 2 points to decide what my slope is. So I'm just going to put a point right here. And then I'm going to put a point right about here. Actually, I could put one right here. There's a couple of points that I could use. Any one of those would be fine. So we're going to count. We're going to say, how do we get from up to here and over? So we're going to count up 1. So 100. Okay. Our rise is 100. And then we're going to go over 100. So we can kind of look at this and say, okay, the same amount of zeros in the numerator as the denominator. So we're left with 1 over 1, which is just a whole number 1. And when we write this as an equation, we could say y equals, we're going to replace the m with 1, x. And then we could say plus a negative 600, or we could just say minus 600. But remember, anytime you have a variable, if you have a variable, there is an imaginary 1 in front. We can say there is a number in front always. So we could actually write this as our final answer as y equals x minus 600. That equation is going to represent this line. All right, let's look at another example of this. All right, so what is the equation of this line? And again, we want y equals mx plus b. So I want to look at first, where is my y-intercept? And I can see looking at this graph that this line is going to cross at the origin. So we would say that my y-intercept is at 0. And then I want to decide what my slope is. So my slope, we're looking at our rise, or we could say our fall over our run. So we could say a couple points to pick out. We could say this one crosses. And then we could say we could use the origin as well for this. When we look at this graph, if we look from left to right, so if we're like reading the graph from left to right, we would see that the graph is going down. And so that's where we're going to see that we're going to have our fall instead of a rise. We're going to be falling. So in order to line up with this point over here, we're going to fall 1 place. So we're going down -1. And then to get to 0, 0, we're going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 places. So this is going to be -1 over 7. So our slope will be -1 over 7. Another way you could do it, if you use the slope formula, okay? So I'm going to write this up here. Y equals -1 over 7x. And then I'm just going to erase this. I want to show you the other way to do it as well. Remember the slope formula says m is equal to y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And so we could take these 2 points. We could say this first ordered pair is at -7, 1. And then we could say the second one is at 0, 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to label each one of those. I'm going to say this one is 0.1, this one is 0.2, and then these numbers here, this y sub 2, that's going to match with these labels that I made. Okay, so if it's y sub 2, I'm going to go to that ordered pair that I labeled as 2, and I want to look at what's in the y spot. And so that would be here, 0, and I'm going to plug in these numbers. 0, and then y sub 1, I'm going to go to that ordered pair I labeled 1, look at what's in the y spot. So 0 minus 1 over, or divided by, and then we would have x sub 2. So go to the ordered pair that you labeled as 2. You've got a 0 in the spot for x. And then we're going to look at x sub 1, which is a minus a -7, which we know a double negative, a negative and a negative is going to give us a positive. So we're saying 0 plus 7. So 0 minus 1 is going to be a -1, and then 0 plus 7 will be 7. So we get the same slope if we use the formula or if we use the graph to check what the answer is going to be. All right, let's look at another example. So here we want to decide what is our y-intercept first. Y equals mx plus b. And I can see that it's going to cross right about here. So it looks like -9. So our y-intercept is -9. And then our slope, we want to pick out 2 points. So I'm going to use this point here. And then I'm also going to use this point right here. I'm going to do it the other way this time. I'm going to do it with the formula that we have. So we know that m is y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. So my 2 points I have are 0, -9. And I have, this is lined up with 4 for my x, and then -6 for my y. So when I label these, I'm going to label this one as 1, this one as 2. Now I'm going to use this to set up my slope formula. All right. So the first number that we want to go for is y sub 2. Okay, so we're going to look at our order pair we labeled 2. We're going to look at what's in the y spot. -6. And then we have y sub 1, which is a -9. And it's always minus, so we're going to say minus a -9, which we can also go back and say a negative and a negative is just going to give us a positive. Then we have x sub 2 in the denominator, which is 4. And then minus, we could say x sub 1, which is 0. And then we solve. -6 plus 9, the signs are different, so we're actually going to end up subtracting, keeping the sign of the larger number, which is a +3. And then 4 minus 0 is a 4. So our slope should be 3/4. And we can write this up here. Y equals 3/4 x. And then our y-intercept is a -9. And I just want to go and check it as well. I want to figure out what my rise over my run is. So from this point to this point, we're going to count 1, 2, we're going up 3 places, and then we're going over 1, 2, 3, 4 places. So that would show us that, yes, our slope does check. And the good thing about this too is you can use the formula to solve, and then you could go back and check your answer on the graph and make sure that everything matches or lines up. Let's look at another one. This graph, we're back to only having quadrant 1 visible to us, but we can still solve the same way that we have with the other examples. So I have y equals mx plus b. And I want to figure out, first I want to look at what is my y-intercept, and I could say, even though we only have quadrant 1, we can see this line is going to line up with 9. That's where it's going to meet the y-axis. So we'd say 9. And then our slope formula is going to be m equals y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And I'm going to set this up down here as well. So I can just plug in my numbers. And the 2 points I'm going to use this point 0 and then 9. And then I'm also going to use, let's use this point right here, which is at 8, 8. So when I label these, I'm going to say this one is 1, this one is 2. And then I'm going to plug in my numbers. I'm going to say, got y sub 2. I'm going to look for that ordered pair I labeled 2. What is in the y, which is 8. Y sub 1. Look for that ordered pair you labeled 1. What's in the y? 9. And then x sub 2 in the denominator, which is going to be 8. And then x sub 1, which is going to be 0. And now I can solve. 8 minus 9 is going to give us a -1. And then 8 minus 0 is 8. So I would say I could write this as y equals -1 over 8x plus 9. And the good thing too with these graphs is an important thing to remember is to check. If you get a negative slope, you want to make sure that if you read your graph from left to right, so if we started at this point, and let's say we're just reading this portion right here, we want to make sure that we are showing a decrease in the slope, that we could see that the slope started at a higher point on the y, and then at this point here, it is going down. Okay, so you do want to check that point, and then we can also check looking at our graph with these 2 points. We can say that We are going to fall one place. So we're going down -1. And then we're lined up with this point. So now we're going to figure out what our run is. So we're counting over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we -1/8, which is the same thing that we got using the formula. Okay, let's look at one more example of this. And now we have the graph that shows all 4 quadrants again. Slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. And then we want to figure out what our y-intercept is. Where does this line cross the y-axis? So we could see here that it's going to cross right about -4. And then we can say, use our formula. M equals, we've got y sub 2, plus y sub 1, or the change in y over the change in x. And then I'm just going to set this up down here so we can just plug in those numbers. And for our points, we can use this point here, which is 0, -4. And then we can use, I'm going to use this point right here, which is going to be a 1 and a 0. So I'm going to label this as 0.1 and this is 0.2. Plug in my numbers. Y2 is 0. And y1 is -4, which I can go back and change this. Negative and a negative is just going to give us a positive. So we can add 0 plus 4 is what we have. And then x2 in the denominator is going to be 1. And x1 is going to be 0. So now we can solve this. We could say 0 plus 4 is just 4. And then 1 minus 0 is 1. So we could reduce this also to just 4. So y equals 4x minus 4 for our y-intercept. And we can check this. We can say that from this point, and you always want to start with the point that's furthest left on the graph. The furthest, the starting point of the graph is the point that you see first when you're reading left to right. So this point here is going to be where we're going to start. We're going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4 places, and then we're lined up with that second point. So now we're going to go over 1 place. So it would check that our slope is going to be 4/1.